The biggest mistake people make with avoidance, thinking silence or kindness will fix them. Neither works the way you think. That's the truth. No one likes to hear. Because when you're dealing with an avoidant, you're not dealing with someone who reacts to logic or strategy or even deliberate efforts to win them back. You're dealing with someone whose entire emotional system is built around self-protection. Avoidants don't respond to what you do on the surface. They respond to what they feel underneath. And that's why both no contact and soft contact fail for most people, because they're used like tactics instead of genuine emotional shifts. You think silence will make them miss you. You think kindness will make them open up. But avoidants don't move because of what you show them. They move because of what they sense inside themselves: pressure, fear, safety, distance, or loss. Their nervous system is wired to pull away the moment they feel controlled, chased, or emotionally responsible for someone else's needs. So when people attempt no contact, it usually backfires because deep down, it's not real no contact. It's a performance. You're quiet but obsessing. You're gone but watching. You're silent but waiting for them to notice. And they can feel that emotional tension even without a single word. On the other hand, soft contact also fails when it's done with the hope of getting a response, getting a reaction, or getting them to come close. An avoidant doesn't hear the sweetness, they feel the expectation behind it. They sense the pressure wrapped inside your politeness. And the moment they feel that weight, they retreat again. This is why so many people get confused and say nothing works on avoidance. But the truth is simple. Avoidants don't respond to strategies. They respond to internal pressure, internal fear, and internal safety, not yours, theirs. When the pressure inside their mind increases, when their need for control dissolves, when distance stops feeling safe, when the fear of losing you grows louder than the fear of closeness, that's when they shift. Not because you went silent, not because you were gentle, but because something inside them changed. And that's why the method is never what matters. What matters is the energy behind it. A calm, emotionally detached. No contact works because it creates space for their internal pressure to rise naturally. A relaxed, expectation-free, soft contact works because it lowers their internal fear and makes you feel safe instead of demanding. In both cases, the avoidant isn't responding to your words, they're responding to the emotional climate you create. And until you understand that, every approach you take will feel like a hit or miss. But once you do, everything about how avoidance operates suddenly makes sense. They don't move because you want them to. They move because their internal world finally pushes them toward you. When you disappear, they finally see what they were running from. Most people misunderstand no contact, thinking it's a punishment, a power move, or a way to teach an avoidant some kind of lesson. But avoidants don't learn through force. They don't grow from confrontation, and they certainly don't respond to emotional pressure disguised as silence. What no contact really does when done correctly is act like a mirror. It reflects their own patterns back to them without you saying a single word. Because when you're gone, when your energy is no longer chasing them, soothing them, or absorbing the distance they create, they're left alone with the truth they've been avoiding. The truth that their behavior didn't just push you away temporarily. It actually cost them something. Avoidants move through relationships believing the other person will always be there because they've learned that pulling away creates space, and that space eventually brings the relationship back into balance. They rely on your patience, your emotional strength, your willingness to come closer every time they retreat. It becomes a cycle where their distance is absorbed by your effort. But when you step back, truly step back, without panic, without waiting, without monitoring them, the cycle breaks. For the first time, they feel the emptiness they thought would protect them. And in that emptiness, they're forced to face themselves. At first, they tell themselves stories to stay emotionally safe. Good, the space is what I needed. Or C, it's easier without the pressure. But those thoughts don't last long because avoidants aren't actually comfortable with distance. They're comfortable with control. When you disappear, they don't just lose the connection, they lose the control. They used to calm their anxiety, and that's when that internal shift begins. Instead of blaming you, instead of focusing on your reactions, they have nothing left to focus on but their own feelings. The regret, the confusion, the sudden loneliness they didn't expect, and the quiet panic that whispers, what if they don't come back? This is when no contact becomes a mirror It shows them the consequences of their shutdowns, their mixed signals, and the emotional walls they built so high they couldn't see you anymore. And for the first time, they are confronted with the weight of their choices without the comfort of your presence pulling them out of their own patterns. Clarity starts to surface. Self-reflection becomes unavoidable. The avoided defenses that once protected them suddenly feel like cages, not shields, because your absence reveals what your presence couldn't. They weren't running from you. They were running from their own emotion. And when you disappear, that emotional truth stands in front of them with nowhere left to hide. That's why no contact isn't punishment. It's the moment an avoidant finally sees themselves clearly and realizes that pushing you away didn't solve anything. It only revealed what they were afraid to face all along. Soft contact works only when your energy says, I'm here, but I'm not waiting. Most people misunderstand soft contact because they treat it like a gentle version of chasing. They send sweet messages, they check in, they stay available, but the energy underneath is anything but soft. It's hopeful, anxious, expectant, and avoidance can feel that emotional pull instantly. To them, soft contact isn't about what you say, it's about what your presence represents. If your energy carries even a hint of pressure, desire for reassurance, or hope for reconnection, their defenses rise again. That's why true soft contact is never chase. It's stability. It's emotional neutrality. It's connection without demand. It's I'm open if you're open, but I'm not holding my breath. Avoidants respond to low pressure connection because it doesn't threaten them. It doesn't trigger their fear of engulfment. It doesn't make them feel responsible for your emotions. It doesn't demand anything from them emotionally or relationally. When you show up calmly without expectation, you become safe by default, not because you're being nice, but because you're being grounded. And grounded energy is what avoidants crave the most, but experience the least. Soft contact gives them something distance never could, room to approach. Not because they're being pulled, but because they're not being pushed. Avoidants don't move toward closeness when they're pressured, they move toward it when they feel free. And freedom is exactly what true soft contact communicates. It says, I won't suffocate you. I won't demand anything from you. I won't interpret your responses as promises or commitments. You're allowed to be exactly where you are. This is what allows their nervous system to relax instead of locking into defense mode. When soft contact is done correctly, the avoidant doesn't feel chased. They feel unjudged. They feel accepted for their pace. They feel safe dipping one toe back into connection without fearing they'll drown. This kind of emotional environment lets them reconnect in small, subtle ways. Short replies, small gestures, casual interactions. These are the steps an avoidant takes when they feel safe, not pressured. And every time you respond with the same calm neutrality, their sense of safety deepens. Because what they fear isn't intimacy itself, it's the loss of control that comes with it. Soft contact gives them the space to move at a pace that feels manageable, not overwhelming. Most people fail at soft contact because they use it with an agenda. They want a response, they want reassurance, they want progress, but an avoidant can sense the weight of your desire even when your words sound relaxed. True soft contact is genuine neutrality, the kind that comes from self-focus, emotional independence, and a willingness to let the connection unfold naturally instead of forcing it. And that's why soft contact works, not because you're showing up, but because you're not pulling, you become a steady presence instead of emotional pressure, a calm signal instead of a desperate broadcast. And in that stability, the avoidant finally feels something they don't feel often, the freedom to come closer without fear. If they pushed you away to regain control, vanishing resets the entire power dynamic. No contact isn't a one-size-fits-all strategy, but there are moments when it works with almost surgical precision, moments when the avoidant's own psychology makes your absence the only thing that can shift the dynamic. And the first moment is when they shut down. When an avoidant reaches emotional overwhelm, they retreat instantly. They disconnect, detach, and go cold to regulate themselves. If you keep pushing, explaining, pleading, or trying to fix what went wrong, their defenses only get stronger. But when you vanish quietly, without resistance, it interrupts their shutdown cycle. Instead of getting relief from your distance, they experience disorientation. Their nervous system, which expected you to chase, suddenly has no external pressure to push against. And in that stillness, they begin to feel the emotional consequences of their withdrawal. No contact also becomes highly effective after betrayal, especially when the avoidant acted carelessly, dismissively, or selfishly because they assumed you would always be there. Avoidants often believe you won't leave, no matter how much distance they create or how inconsistent their behavior becomes. This isn't arrogance, it's conditioning. They rely on your history of emotional resilience. So when betrayal happens, whether through disrespect, disinterest, or emotional neglect, disappearing becomes the jolt that breaks their illusion of permanence. Your absence forces them to confront the reality that their actions did have consequences, and that the person they underestimated actually had boundaries they never expected. Another moment when no contact works powerfully is when you chased too much. Over-pursuit is the oxygen an avoidant uses to maintain distance. Every time you reach out, explain, reassure, or try to reconnect, you unintentionally confirm their belief that they can retreat without losing anything. But when you stop chasing, not as a manipulation, but as a genuine pullback, the dynamic flips. The emotional pressure that once lived on your side moves to theirs. They begin to feel the unfamiliar sensation of relational responsibility. They begin to wonder about your silence, your absence, your sudden lack of availability. For the first time, the avoidant isn't in complete control of the emotional distance. You are, and that reversal forces them to reevaluate everything. Most importantly, no contact breaks their pattern of relying on your emotional labor. Avoidants subconsciously depend on the other person to maintain the relationship stability, manage emotional closeness, and smooth over every rupture. You've been the one holding the emotional weight, bridging the gaps, and recentering the connection every time they pulled away. But when you step back completely, you remove the foundation they relied on. You stop carrying what they never lifted. You stop being the emotional buffer that allowed them to coast through the relationship without reflection. Suddenly, the avoidant feels the absence of your effort, the quiet that comes when you no longer compensate for their avoidance. And in that silence, something inside them shifts. Because no contact isn't about punishing them, it's about forcing a psychological reset. One where they finally feel the weight of their own distance and the reality that you won't hold the relationship together alone. Avoidants don't trust words. They trust the calm energy of someone who no longer needs anything from them. Soft contact becomes the most effective approach when the avoidant didn't run from you. They ran from the intensity of their own emotions. Avoidants often retreat, not because something is wrong with the connection, but because the connection feels too powerful, too vulnerable, too demanding on their tightly controlled emotional system. When this is the case, disappearing completely can feel like abandonment, confirming their fear that closeness always ends in loss. Soft contact, however, gives them a gentle signal that you're not gone, but you're also not waiting for them to come back on your terms. It lowers the emotional charge instead of amplifying it. Soft contact also works when they still show small signs of interest. Even after pulling back, avoidants rarely come back with dramatic declarations. They come back through subtle gestures, a brief check-in, a like on social media, a casual reply, a small question. These micro reaches are their cautious attempts to reconnect without exposing themselves to emotional pressure. If you go silent at this moment, they may interpret it as rejection or confirmation that their fears were justified. But if you respond with neutral, grounded softness, you create a bridge they feel safe standing on. You allow them to re-enter connection at their own pace without overwhelming them or feeding their fear of suffocation. Soft contact is also powerful when the connection was strong but poorly timed. Maybe life stress, transitions, emotional overload, or personal instability made intimacy feel like too much for them in the moment. Avoidants don't handle emotional demand well, and when too much happens at once, even good things, they retreat to regulate. In these scenarios, no contact can feel like an emotional cliff. But soft contact provides a slow, steady path back into closeness, one that doesn't require emotional labor. They aren't ready to give. It says the door is still open, but you don't have to walk through it right now. That level of freedom is exactly what allows an avoidant to reestablish connection naturally, rather than defensively. Most importantly, soft contact works best when the avoidant fears pressure more than distance. Avoidants aren't scared of space, they're scared of expectation. When they feel even the slightest emotional demand, their instinct is to retreat. But when you show up with steady, low pressure energy, you become someone who doesn't activate their fear response. You become safe, predictable, and emotionally neutral, not needy, intense, or demanding. They don't have to protect themselves from you. And that safety creates the opening for them to slowly come closer. Soft contact is never about pursuing. It's about offering a stable emotional climate where the avoidant feels free rather than trapped. It gives them space without disconnecting. It gives them connection without pressure. It gives them reassurance without expectation. And in that delicate balance, their defenses soften, their fear quiets, and their own desire for closeness has room to breathe again. Your silence doesn't just confuse them, it exposes their deepest fear, losing someone without a fight. When an avoidant is met with real, grounded, no contact, they don't move through just one emotion. They move through a sequence, a psychological progression that unfolds slowly, quietly, and often invisibly. The first stage is relief. When you stop reaching out, stop asking for clarity, stop trying to reconnect, their nervous system initially relaxes, avoidants retreat to regulate themselves, and your silence gives them exactly what their overwhelmed mind thinks it wants. Space. In this moment, they tell themselves they're fine. They convince themselves distance is good. They believe they've regained emotional stability. But the relief is temporary, because once the initial calm settles, something unexpected creeps in: confusion. Confusion hits when they notice your absence doesn't feel like peace. It feels like something is missing. They expected you to wait, to orbit, to send a subtle signal that you were still there. But the silence stays silent, and that's when their mind starts to spiral. They question whether you're upset, whether you've given up, or whether you've already moved on. Avoidants hate uncertainty, and your lack of reaction becomes the one thing they can't make sense of. This confusion slowly transitions into the next stage, rumination. This is where the avoidant begins replaying things in their mind: conversations, moments, arguments, intimacy, silence. They analyze every detail because they don't understand how you could disappear so completely when you were once so present. Rumination is the stage that breaks their internal narrative. It's where they begin to see the ways they pushed you away, the moments they shut down, the times they withdrew and expected you to carry the emotional load. And it's exactly this reflection that gives birth to regret. Not dramatic regret, quiet regret. The kind avoidants feel but don't express. They start to realize that their distance didn't protect them, it harmed them. They recognize the ways they misinterpreted your intentions or took your stability for granted, and your silence becomes a mirror reflecting everything they avoided facing earlier. When regret settles, the emotional shift becomes even deeper: quiet panic. This isn't loud, frantic panic, it's the silent kind that lives behind a calm exterior. The fear that whispers, did I lose them? Did I push too far? Are they not coming back? Avoidants rarely show this panic outwardly because it threatens their sense of control. But inside, it grows stronger each day. Your silence continues. The panic isn't about missing the relationship. It's about realizing they no longer know where they stand with you. And for someone who relies on predictability, that uncertainty is terrifying. Finally, the last stage appears: the urge to return, but not knowing how. Avoidants don't reach out easily. They fear rejection, pressure, and emotional exposure. So even when they want to reconnect, they hesitate. They debate whether you'll respond, whether you're still open, whether they even have the right to reach out. This internal conflict keeps them stuck at the doorway of reconnection, wanting to walk through it, but too unsure of their place to knock. And that's the truth. Your silence doesn't hurt them. It reveals them to themselves. Your calm presence does what no confrontation ever could. It lowers their guard. When an avoidant is met with genuine soft contact, something subtle but powerful begins to shift inside them. Unlike no contact, which triggers their fear of loss, soft contact gently disarms the fear of pressure. It doesn't demand, it doesn't overwhelm, and it doesn't question. It simply exists as a steady, quiet signal of safety. This is the emotional environment where avoidants feel most capable of reconnecting, because it allows them to move toward closeness without feeling threatened or exposed. And the first thing this gentle presence does is rebuild trust. Avoidants don't trust intensity. They don't trust big emotional swings. They don't trust the people who rush in and then collapse when things get difficult. What they trust is consistency, calm, steady, predictable emotional rhythm. When your energy isn't chasing or demanding, they realize you're not trying to pull them anywhere. And that stability rebuilds trust far more effectively than any apology, explanation, or confrontation ever could. Next, soft contact reduces their fear. Avoidants live with a constant internal tension. The fear of losing themselves in a relationship, the fear of being responsible for someone else's emotions, the fear of being needed too much. When you reach out with no pressure attached, you reduce that tension. You show them that connection doesn't have to come with emotional suffocation. Your light, unforced presence teaches their nervous system that closeness isn't always overwhelming. And because of that, they slowly begin to relax in your presence again. For avoidance, relaxation is rare, and it's the precursor to emotional openness. Soft contact also shows them you aren't a threat. Avoidants withdraw because they anticipate emotional demands before they happen. They brace for pressure even when nothing is being asked of them. But when you show up in a way that doesn't require anything, no reassurance, no promises, no timelines, you become someone they don't have to defend themselves against. They stop scanning for danger. They stop preparing excuses. They stop building emotional walls in anticipation of your needs. Your neutrality creates a space where their defenses naturally soften, not because you force them to, but because they no longer feel the need to protect themselves. And this emotional openness creates the final shift. Soft contact opens the door for small steps back toward closeness. Avoidants return quietly. They test the water before stepping into it. They send short replies, small check-ins, subtle signals, not because they don't care, but because these tiny movements feel safer than big leaps. Soft contact gives them the freedom to come closer without feeling judged or trapped. Every gentle interaction becomes an invitation rather than an obligation. And little by little, they start to reconnect, not out of guilt, not out of fear, but out of comfort. That's the power of soft contact. It creates an emotional space where their fear can calm down long enough for their desire to surface. They don't return because you push, they return because your calm presence makes closeness feel safe again. If your silence is emotional manipulation, they feel it instantly. No contact doesn't fail because avoidants are immune to distance. It fails because most people do it from the wrong emotional place. Avoidants don't just react to what you say or do, they react to the emotional energy behind it. They can sense tension, expectation, anger, or panic even when you're completely silent. So if your no contact isn't grounded, calm, and genuinely detached, it won't work. Why? Because avoidants feel pressure even in distance. Silence, when used with an agenda, becomes another form of emotional pursuit, and their defenses respond to it just as fast as they respond to chasing. This is the part most people never understand. Avoidants don't run from communication, they run from emotional weight. And no contact done with emotional weight collapses the moment it begins. No contact fails first when you're doing it to punish them. If your silence is meant to teach them a lesson, make them miss you, or hurt them back, the avoidant doesn't feel the loss, they feel the hostility, they feel the emotional spike underneath the silence, the passive-aggressive withdrawal, the intention to get a reaction, and instead of drawing them toward you, it pushes them deeper into avoidance because punishment activates their core wound. Closeness is dangerous. People hurt me. I can't trust this connection. They don't interpret your silence as strength. They interpret it as emotional volatility. It also fails when you're still emotionally reactive online. Avoidants are highly attuned to changes in your emotional state, even from afar. Posting sad quotes, angry captions, attention-seeking stories, or anything designed to be seen indirectly sends a crystal clear message. You're still invested. You're still hurting. You're still chasing. And as soon as they sense that emotional pursuit, their nervous system locks up again. Even if you're not contacting them directly, the digital emotional pressure is enough to keep them distant. No contact doesn't work if your online presence contradicts your silence. Another reason no contact fails is when you break it too soon. Most people panic when the avoidant doesn't return immediately. They think the silence isn't working, so they reach out, giving the avoidant instant validation that their distance is still safe and still in control. Every early reach out confirms the pattern. You'll come back eventually. I don't need to. Breaking silence early resets the entire dynamic back to the avoidant's comfort zone, where you carry the emotional load and they maintain distance. But the biggest reason no contact fails is when you're obsessing instead of healing. No contact only works when you're genuinely shifting your focus inward, not counting days, not waiting for a message, not stalking their activity, not living in emotional limbo. Avoidants feel it when you're emotionally stuck on them, even without physical communication. They feel the invisible pull, and that pull keeps them in defense mode. True no contact works when your energy detaches, not just your actions. When you use the silence to rebuild your sense of self instead of trying to control their reaction. When your absence isn't an act, it's a reality. Because avoidants don't respond to tactics. They respond to the emotional truth behind them. And if your silence is rooted in pain, fear, or manipulation, they'll sense it instantly, and they'll stay exactly where they are. If they feel the slightest expectation behind your softness, they shut down. Soft contact is delicate. It can be one of the most effective ways to reconnect with an avoidant, but only if it's delivered without hidden pressure. Avoidants are finely tuned to emotional cues, far more than words alone, and they sense when your calmness carries even a trace of expectation. If you're waiting for a response, their subconscious radar picks up your hope, your anticipation, and your need for reassurance. That energy is interpreted as pressure, and the moment they feel it, their instinct is to withdraw. Soft contact stops being an invitation. It becomes a threat. Your kindness can also fail if it carries an agenda. Compliments, messages, or gestures that are meant to elicit a specific reaction to get them to care more, respond faster, or acknowledge your value don't land as generosity, they land as expectation. Avoidants don't respond to gestures with strings attached. They respond to gestures that signal calmness, neutrality, and freedom. Similarly, being too available undermines soft contact. If your presence is constant, your attention predictable, or your energy too accessible, they sense that emotional availability as a cage rather than a bridge. They need room to approach at their own pace. And perhaps the most common reason soft contact fails is when it hides a hidden chase. You might think you're subtle, gentle, or just being nice, but if your energy is secretly measuring, monitoring, or hoping for reciprocity, they will feel it instantly. Avoidants don't need more words, they need absence of pressure. When softness is used as a tool to control, influence, or draw them in, it backfires, and they shut down quietly. Soft contact is not about making them respond. It's about creating an environment where they can respond safely. Anything else is manipulation, whether intentional or not. This brings us to the truth. They don't want you to know. The method itself doesn't change them. Your energy does. Avoidants never return because you mastered a strategy. They return because your presence, whether through absence or calm neutrality, triggers safety, reflection, and clarity. No contact only works when you're genuinely detached. When your focus has shifted from them to yourself, when you are emotionally independent and free of need. Soft contact only works when you're genuinely stable, when your calmness isn't a tactic, but a reflection of your inner balance. The avoidance response is never about the steps you take. It's about the emotional climate you create. They return to safety, not strategy. They return to someone whose energy doesn't demand, doesn't pressure, and doesn't chase. They respond to clarity, not manipulation. They respond to the quiet confidence of a person who is fully present in themselves, whether that presence is expressed through absence or subtle, grounded connection. The ultimate takeaway is simple but profound. It's not the plan, it's not the sequence of moves, and it's certainly not the right trick that makes them come back. It's the authenticity of your energy, your calm, your stability, your detachment, and your self-focus. When you embody that, the avoidant is drawn not because you want them to return, but because they feel safe enough to finally face what they've been avoiding. If you want an avoidant to come back, stop trying to get them back. It's counterintuitive, but the truth about avoidance is that your efforts, strategies, and chase rarely pull them closer. In fact, they often push them further away. Avoidants respond not to your pursuit, but to your energy. They mirror the emotional climate you create, and they are drawn to stability, calmness, and neutrality rather than urgency, neediness, or attempts to control them. This is why the real power doesn't lie in the messages you send, the timing of your calls, or the perfection of your no contact or soft contact plan. It lies in the shifts you make inside yourself. The first shift is emotional neutrality. Avoidants are hypersensitive to pressure, expectation, and intensity. When your energy is calm, steady, and emotionally independent, it removes the subconscious threat they constantly perceive in relationships. Emotional neutrality doesn't mean indifference, it means you are fully grounded, emotionally balanced, and not reliant on their behavior to feel safe or validated. When they sense this neutrality, their defenses lower because there is no danger in reconnecting, and that's the exact space they need to reconsider their distance. The second shift is self-focus. Instead of obsessing over their actions, analyzing their behavior, or crafting ways to elicit a response, you focus on your own growth, goals, and well-being. Self-focus is magnetic because avoidants are subconsciously drawn to people who lead fulfilled, independent lives. When you prioritize your own development, they can finally see you as a whole person, not someone whose identity revolves around them. And that perspective forces them to confront their own avoidance patterns rather than blaming external circumstances or their partner. The third shift is detachment. Detachment is not coldness or punishment, it's freedom. It's the ability to interact with someone without being emotionally dependent on their approval, affection, or presence. When you operate from detachment, you remove the invisible emotional leash that most avoidants subconsciously resist. Detachment signals that you are not a threat, you are not desperate, and you are not available on demand. And that is exactly what creates the space for them to reflect on their own behaviors and feelings. The final shift is rebuilding your own life. Avoidants often leave because they feel overwhelmed, pressured, or emotionally suffocated. When you reclaim your time, energy, and focus for yourself, when you pursue passions, nurture your well-being, and cultivate independence, it demonstrates a life of stability they unconsciously crave. This isn't about proving anything to them. It's about living authentically. And in witnessing this, they are forced to confront the fact that they may have lost something real, grounding, and irreplaceable. Ultimately, these internal shifts, emotional neutrality, self-focus, detachment, and rebuilding your own life, create a mirror for the avoidant. They expose their patterns, their fears, and their avoidance without a single word from you. You no longer need to try to make them come back because your presence, calm, independent, and unshakably grounded, does the work for you. The avoidant begins to face themselves, not because of your effort, but because your energy makes it impossible to hide from the truth. And that is the real power, not in chasing, not in strategies, but in becoming someone whose life is whole enough to attract them without trying.